Καλησπέρα και καλώς ήρθατε σε άλλη μια λέξη εκφραστικής ανάγνωσης εν μέσω κορονοϊού 2020. Σήμερα είναι 31 Οκτωβρίου και ορισμένα μέρη του πλανήτη μας γιορτάζουν το Halloween. Εγώ δεν το γιορτάζω, αλλά αυτό δεν σημαίνει ότι δεν μπορούμε να διαβάσουμε μια ιστορία φαντασμάτων, ας πούμε. Και ένας από τους μέτρ του είδους ήταν ο Henry James. Επέλεξα την ιστορία The Way It Came or The Friends of the Friends. I find, as you prophesied, much that's interesting, but little that helps the delicate question, the possibility of publication. Her diaries are less systematic than I hoped. She only had a blessed habit of noting and narrating. She summarized, she saved. She appears seldom indeed to have let a good story pass without catching it on the wing. I allude, of course, not so much to things she had as to things she saw and felt. She writes sometimes of herself, sometimes of others, sometimes of the combination. It's under this last rubric that she's usually most vivid. But it's not, you will understand, when she's most vivid that she's always most publishable. To tell the truth, she's fearfully indiscreet, or has at least all the material for making me so. Take as an instance the fragment I send you. After dividing it for your convenience into several small chapters, it is the contents of a thin blank book which I have had copied out and which has the merit of being nearly enough a rounded thing, an intelligible whole. These pages evidently date from years ago. I've read with the liveliest wonder the statement they so circumstantially make, and done my best to swallow the prodigy they leave to be inferred. These things would be striking, wouldn't they? To any reader. But can you imagine for a moment my placing such a document before the world, even though, as if she herself had desired the world should have the benefit of it, she has given her friends neither name nor initials? Have you any sort of clue to their identity? I leave her the floor. I know perfectly, of course, that I brought it upon myself, but that doesn't make it any better. I was the first to speak of her to him. He had never even heard her mentioned. Even if I had happened not to speak, someone else would have made up for it. I tried afterwards to find comfort in that reflection, but the comfort of reflections is thin. The only comfort that counts in life is not to have been a fool. That's a beatitude I shall doubtless never enjoy. Why, you ought to meet her and talk it over, is what I immediately said. Birds of a feather flock together. I told him who she was, and that they were birds of a feather, because if he had had in youth a strange adventure, she had had about the same time just such another. It was well known to her friends, an incident she was constantly called on to describe. She was charming, clever, pretty, unhappy, but it was none the less the thing to which she had originally owed her reputation. Being at the age of 18 somewhere abroad with an aunt, she had had a vision of one of her parents at the moment of death. The parent was in England, hundreds of miles away, and so far as she knew, neither dying nor dead. It was by day in the museum of some great foreign town. She had passed alone, in advance of her companions, into a small room containing some famous work of art, and occupied at that moment by two other persons. One of these was an old custodian. The second, before observing him, she took for a stranger, a tourist. She was merely conscious that he was bareheaded and seated on a bench. The instant her eyes rested on him, however, she beheld to her amazement her father, who, as if he had long waited for her, looked at her in singular distress with an impatience that was akin to reproach. She rushed to him with a bewildered cry, "Papa, what is it?" But this was followed by an exhibition of still livelier feeling when on her movement he simply vanished, leaving the custodian and her relations, who were at her heels, to gather round her in dismay. These persons, the official, the aunt, the cousins, were therefore in a manner witnesses of the fact at least of the impression made on her. And there was the further testimony of a doctor who was attending one of the party, and to whom it was immediately afterwards communicated. He gave her a remedy for hysterics, but said to the aunt privately, "Wait and see if something doesn't happen at home." Something had happened. The poor father, suddenly and violently seized, had died that morning. The aunt, the mother's sister, received before the day was out a telegram announcing the event and requesting her to prepare her niece for it. Her niece was already prepared, and the girl's sense of this visitation remained, of course, indelible. We had all as her friends had it conveyed to us, and had conveyed it creepily to each other. 12 years had elapsed, and as a woman who had made an unhappy marriage and lived apart from her husband, she had become interesting from other sources. But since the name she now bore was a name frequently borne, and since moreover her judicial separation, as things were going, could hardly count as a distinction, it was usual to qualify her as the one, you know, who saw her father's ghost. As for him, dear man, he had seen his mother's. I had never heard of that till this occasion on which our pleasanter acquaintance led him, through some turn of the subject of our talk, to mention it, and to inspire me in so doing with the impulse to let him know that he had a rival in the field, a person with whom he could compare notes. Later on his story became for him, perhaps because of my unduly repeating it, likewise a convenient worldly label, but it had not a year before been the ground on which he was introduced to me. He had other merits, just as she, poor thing, had others. I can honestly say that I was quite aware of them from the first. I discovered them sooner than he discovered mine. I remember how it struck me even at the time that his sense of mine was quickened by my having been able to match, though not indeed straight from my own experience, his curious anecdote. It dated, this anecdote, as hers did, from some dozen years before, a year in which, at Oxford, he had for some reason of his own been staying on into the long. He had been in the August afternoon on the river. Coming back into his room while it was still distinct daylight, he found his mother standing there as if her eyes had been fixed on the door. He had had a letter from her that morning out of Wales, where she was staying with her father. At the sight of him she smiled with extraordinary radiance and extended her arms to him, and then as he sprang forward and joyfully opened his own, she vanished from the place. He wrote to her that night, telling her what had happened. The letter had been carefully preserved. The next morning he heard of her death. He was through this chance of our talk extremely struck with the little prodigy I was able to produce for him. He had never encountered another case. Certainly they ought to meet, my friend and he. Certainly they would have something in common. I would arrange this, wouldn't I? If she didn't mind, for himself he didn't mind in the least. I had promised to speak to her of the matter as soon as possible, and within the week I was able to do so. She minded as little as he. She was perfectly willing to see him, and yet no meeting was to occur, as meetings are commonly understood. That's just half my tale, the extraordinary way it was hindered. This was the fault of a series of accidents, but the accidents continued for years and became, for me and for others, a subject of hilarity with either party. They were droll enough at first, then they grew rather a bore. The odd thing was that both parties were amenable. It wasn't a case of their being indifferent, much less of their being indisposed. It was one of the caprices of chance, aided, I suppose, by some opposition of their interests and habits. His was centred in his office, his eternal inspectorship, which left him small leisure, constantly calling him away and making him break engagements. He liked society, but he found it everywhere and took it at a run. I never knew at a given moment where he was, and there were times when for months together I never saw him. She was on her side practically suburban. She lived at Richmond and never went out. She was a woman of distinction, but not of fashion, and felt, as people said, her situation. Decidedly proud and rather whimsical, she lived her life as she had planned it. There were things one could do with her, but one couldn't make her come to one's parties. One went, indeed, a little more than seemed quite convenient to hers, which consisted of her cousin, a cup of tea, and the view. The tea was good, but the view was familiar, though perhaps not, like the cousin, a disagreeable old maid who had been of the group at that museum and with whom she now lived, offensively so. This connection with an inferior relative, which had partly an economical motive, she proclaimed her companion a marvellous manager, was one of the little perversities we had to forgive her. Another was her estimate of the proprieties created by her rupture with her husband. That was extreme. Many persons called it even morbid. She made no advances. She cultivated scruples. She suspected, or I should perhaps rather say she remembered slights. She was one of the few women I have known whom that particular predicament had rendered modest rather than bold. Dear thing, she had some delicacy. Especially marked were the limits she had set to possible attentions from men. It was always her thought that her husband was waiting to pounce on her. She discouraged if she didn't forbid the visits of male persons not senile. She said she could never be too careful. When I first mentioned to her that I had a friend whom fate had distinguished in the same weird way as herself, I put her quite at liberty to say, "Oh, bring him out to see me." I should probably have been able to bring him, and a situation perfectly innocent, or at any rate comparatively simple, would have been created. But she uttered no such word. She only said, "I must meet him, certainly. Yes, I shall look out for him." That caused the first delay, and meanwhile various things happened. One of them was that as time went on, she made charming as she was more and more friends, and that it regularly befell that these friends were sufficiently also friends of his to bring him up in conversation. It was odd that without belonging, as it were, to the same world, or, according to the horrid term, the same set, my baffled pair should have happened in so many cases to fall in with the same people and make them join in the funny chorus. She had friends who didn't know each other, but who inevitably and punctually recommended him. She had also the sort of originality and the intrinsic interest that led her to be kept by each of us as a kind of private resource, cultivated jealously, more or less in secret, as a person whom one didn't meet in society, whom it was not for everyone, whom it was not for the vulgar, to approach, and with whom, therefore, acquaintance was particularly difficult and particularly precious. We saw her separately, with appointments and conditions, and found it made on the whole for harmony not to tell each other. Somebody had always had a note from her, still later than somebody else. There was some silly woman who, for a long time, among the unprivileged, owed to 3 simple visits to Richmond a reputation for being intimate with lots of awfully clever, out-of-the-way people. Everyone has had friends it has seemed a happy thought to bring together, and everyone remembers that his happiest thoughts have not been his greatest successes. But I doubt if there was ever a case in which the failure was in such direct proportion to the quantity of influence set in motion. It is really perhaps here the quantity of influence that was most remarkable. My lady and gentleman each declared to me and others that it was like the subject of a roaring farce. The reason first given had with time dropped out of sight, and 50 better ones flourished on top of it. They were so awfully alike. They had the same ideas and tricks and tastes, the same prejudices and superstitions and heresies. They said the same things and sometimes did them. They liked and disliked the same persons and places, the same books, authors and styles. Anyone could see a certain identity even in their looks and their features. It established much of a propriety that they were in common parlance equally nice and almost equally handsome. But the great sameness for wander and chatter was their rare perversity in regard to being photographed. They were the only persons ever heard of who had never been taken and who had a passionate objection to it. They just wouldn't be, for anything anyone could say. I had loudly complained of this. Him in particular I had so vainly desired to be able to show on my drawing-room chimney-piece in a Bond Street frame. It was at any rate the very liveliest of all the reasons why they ought to know each other, all the lively reasons reduced to naught by the strange law that had made them bang so many doors in each other's face, made them the buckets in the well, the 2 ends of the seesaw, the 2 parties in the state, so that when one was up, the other was down, when one was out, the other was in, neither by any possibility entering a house till the other had left it, or leaving it all unawares till the other was at hand. They only arrived when they had been given up, which was precisely also when they departed. They were, in a word, alternate and incompatible. They missed each other with an inveteracy that could be explained only by its being preconcerted. It was, however, so far from preconcerted that it had ended, literally after several years, by disappointing and annoying them. I don't think their curiosity was lively till it had been proved utterly vain. A great deal was, of course, done to help them, but it merely laid wires for them to trip. To give examples, I should have taken notes, but I happened to remember that neither had ever been able to dine on the right occasion. The right occasion for each was the occasion that would be wrong for the other. On the wrong one, they were most punctual, and there were never any but wrong ones. The very elements conspired, and the constitution of man reinforced them. A cold, a headache, a bereavement, a storm, a fog, an earthquake, a cataclysm infallibly intervened. The whole business was beyond a joke. Yet as a joke it had still to be taken, though one couldn't help feeling that the joke had made the situation serious, had produced on the part of each a consciousness, an awkwardness, a positive dread of the last accident of all, the only one with any freshness left, the accident that would bring them face to face. The final effect of its predecessors had been to kindle this instinct. They were quite ashamed, perhaps even a little, of each other. So much preparation, so much frustration, what indeed could be good enough for it all to lead up to? A mere meeting would be mere flatness. Did I see them at the end of years, they often asked, just stupidly confronted? If they were bored by the joke, they might be worse bored by something else. They made exactly the same reflections, and each in some manner was sure to hear of the others. I really think it was this peculiar diffidence that finally controlled the situation. I mean that if they had failed for the first year or 2 because they couldn't help it, they kept up the habit because they had, what shall I call it, grown nervous. It really took some lurking volition to account for anything so absurd. When to crown now our long acquaintance I accepted his renewed offer of marriage, it was humorously said, I know, that I had made the gift of his photograph a condition. This was so far true that I had refused to give him mine without it. At any rate, I had him at last, in his high distinction, on the chimney-piece, where the day she called to congratulate me she came nearer than she had ever done to seeing him. He had set her in being taken an example which I invited her to follow. He had sacrificed his perversity. Wouldn't she sacrifice hers? She too must give me something on my engagement. Wouldn't she give me the companion piece? She laughed and shook her head. She had head shakes, whose impulse seemed to come from as far away as the breeze that stirs a flower. The companion piece to the portrait of my future husband was the portrait of his future wife. She had taken her stand. She could depart from it as little as she could explain it. It was a prejudice, an entendement, a vow. She would live and die unphotographed. Now, too, she was alone in that state. This was what she liked. It made her so much more original. She rejoiced in the fall of her late associate and looked a long time at his picture, about which she made no memorable remark, though she even turned it over to see the back. About her engagement she was charming, full of cordiality and sympathy. "You've known him even longer than I've not," she said, "and that seems a very long time." She understood how we had jogged together over hill and dale, and how inevitable it was that we should now rest together. I'm definite about all this because what followed is so strange that it's a kind of relief to me to mark the point up to which our relations were as natural as ever. It was I myself who in a sudden madness altered and destroyed them. I see now that she gave me no pretext, and that I only found one in the way she looked at the fine face in the Bond Street frame. How then would I have had her look at it? What I had wanted from the first was to make her care for him. Well, that was what I still wanted, up to the moment of her having promised me that he would on this occasion really aid me to break the silly spell that had kept them asunder. I had arranged with him to do his part if she would as triumphantly do hers. I was on a different footing now. I was in a footing to answer for him. I would positively engage that at 5 on the following Saturday he would be on that spot. He was out of town on pressing business, but pledged to keep his promise to the letter. He would return on purpose and in abundant time. "Are you perfectly sure?" I remember she asked, looking grave and considering. I thought she had turned a little pale. She was tired. She was indisposed. It was a pity he was to see her after all at so poor a moment. If he only could have seen her 5 years before. However, I replied that this time I was sure, and that success therefore depended simply on herself. At 5 o'clock on the Saturday she would find him in a particular chair I pointed out, the one in which he usually sat, and in which, though this I didn't mention, he had been sitting when, the week before, he put the question of our future to me in the way that had brought me round. She looked at it in silence, just as she had looked at the photograph, while I repeated for the 20th time that it was too preposterous, it shouldn't somehow be feasible to introduce to one's dearest friend one's second self. "Am I your dearest friend?" she asked with a smile that for a moment brought back her beauty. I replied by pressing her to my bosom, after which she said, "Well, I'll come. I'm extraordinarily afraid, but you may count on me." When she had left me, I began to wonder what she was afraid of, for she had spoken as if she fully meant it. The next day, late in the afternoon, I had 3 lines from her. She had found on getting home the announcement of her husband's death. She had not seen him for 7 years, but she wished me to know it in this way before I should hear of it in another. It made, however, in her life, strange and sad to say, so little difference that she would scrupulously keep her appointment. I rejoiced for her. I supposed it would make at least the difference of her having more money. But even in this diversion, far from forgetting that she had said she was afraid, I seemed to catch sight of her reason for her being so. Her fear, as the evening went on, became contagious, and the contagion took in my breast the form of a sudden panic. It wasn't jealousy, it was a dread of jealousy. I called myself a fool for not having been quiet till we were man and wife. After that I should somehow feel secure. It was only a question of waiting another month, a trifle surely for people who had waited so long. It had been plain enough she was nervous, and now that she was free, she naturally wouldn't be less so. What was her nervousness therefore but a presentiment? She had been hitherto the victim of interference, but it was quite possible she would henceforth be the source of it. The victim in that case would be my simple self. What had the interference been but the finger of Providence pointing out a danger? The danger was, of course, for poor me. It had been kept at bay by a series of accidents unexampled in their frequency, but the reign of accident was now visibly at an end. I had an intimate conviction that both parties would keep the tryst. It was more and more impressed upon me that they were approaching, converging. We had talked about breaking the spell. Well, it would be effectually broken, unless indeed it should merely take another form and overdo their encounters as it had overdone their escapes. This was something I couldn't sit still for thinking of. It kept me awake. At midnight I was full of unrest. At last I felt there was only one way of laying the ghost. If the reign of accident was over, I must just take up the succession. I sat down and wrote a hurried note which would meet him on his return, and which, as the servants had gone to bed, I sallied forth bareheaded into the empty, gusty street to drop into the nearest pillar-box. It was to tell him that I shouldn't be able to be at home in the afternoon, as I had hoped, and that he must postpone his visit till dinner-time. This was an implication that he would find me alone. When accordingly at 5 she presented herself, I naturally felt false and base. My act had been a momentary madness, but I had at least to be consistent. She remained an hour. He, of course, never came, and I could only persist in my perfidy. I had thought it best to let her come. Singular as this now seems to me, I thought it diminished my guilt. Yet as she sat there, so visibly white and weary, stricken with a sense of everything her husband's death had opened up, I felt an almost intolerable pang of pity and remorse. If I didn't tell her on the spot what I had done, it was because I was too ashamed. I feigned astonishment. I feigned it to the end. I protested that if ever I had had confidence, I had it that day. I blush as I tell my story. I take it as my penance. There was nothing indignant I didn't say about him. I invented suppositions, attenuations. I admitted in stupefaction, as the hands of the clock travelled, that their luck hadn't turned. She smiled at this vision of their luck, but she looked anxious. She looked unusual. The only thing that kept me up was the fact that, oddly enough, she wore mourning. No great depths of crape, but simple and scrupulous black. She had in her bonnet 3 small black feathers. She carried a little muff of astrahan. This put me by the aid of some acute reflection a little in the right. She had written to me that the sudden event made no difference for her, but apparently it made as much difference as that. If she was inclined to the usual forms, why didn't she observe that of not going the first day or 2 out to tea? There was someone she wanted so much to see that she couldn't wait till her husband was buried. Such a betrayal of eagerness made me hard and cruel enough to practise my odious deceit, though at the same time, as the hour waxed and waned, I suspected in her something deeper still than disappointment, and somewhat less successfully concealed. I mean a strange underlying relief, the soft, slow emission of the breath that comes when a danger is past. What happened as she spent her barren hour with me was that at last she gave him up. She let him go forever. She made the most graceful joke of it that I've ever seen made of anything, but it was for all that great date in her life. She spoke with her mild gaiety of all the other vain times, the long game of hide-and-seek, the unprecedented queerness of such a relation. For it was, or had been, a relation, wasn't it? Hadn't it? That was just the absurd part of it. When she got up to go, I said to her that it was more a relation than ever, but that I hadn't the face after what had occurred to propose to her for the present another opportunity. It was plain that the only valid opportunity would be my accomplished marriage. Of course she would be at my wedding. It was even to be hoped that he would. If I am, he won't be, she declared with a laugh. I admitted there might be something in that. The thing was therefore to get us safely married first. That won't help us. Nothing will help us, she said as she kissed me farewell. I shall never see him. It was with those words she left me. I could bear her disappointment, as I've called it, but when a couple of hours later I received him at dinner, I found that I couldn't bear his. The way my manoeuvre might have affected him had not been particularly present to me, but the result of it was the first word of reproach that had ever yet dropped from him. I say reproach because that expression is scarcely too strong for the terms in which he conveyed to me his surprise that under the extraordinary circumstances I should not have found some means not to deprive him of such an occasion. I might really have managed either not to be obliged to go out or to let their meeting take place at all the same. They would probably have got on in my drawing-room without me. At this I quite broke down. I confessed my iniquity and the miserable reason of it. I had not put her off, and I had not gone out. She had been there, and after waiting for him an hour, had departed in the belief that he had been absent by his own fault. "She must think me a precious brute!" he exclaimed. "Did she say of me what she had a right to say? I assure you she said nothing that showed the least feeling. She looked at your photograph, she even turned around the back of it, on which your address happens to be inscribed. It had provoked her to no demonstration. She doesn't care so much as all that." "Then why are you afraid of her?" "It was not of her I was afraid, it was of you. Did you think I would fall in love with her? You never alluded to such a possibility before," he went on as I remained silent. "Admirable person as you pronounced her, that wasn't the light in which you showed her to me. Do you mean that if it had been you would have managed by this time to catch a glimpse of her? I didn't fear things then," I added. "I hadn't the same reason." He kissed me at this, and when I remembered that she had done so an hour or two before, I felt for an instant as if he were taking from my lips the very pressure of hers. In spite of kisses, the incident had shed a certain chill, and I suffered horribly from the sense that he had seen me guilty of a fraud. He had seen it only through my frank avowal, but I was as unhappy as if I had a stain to efface. I couldn't get over the manner of his looking at me when I spoke of her apparent indifference to his not having come. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed to have expressed a doubt of my word. Before we parted, I told him that I would undeceive her, start the first thing in the morning for Richmond, and there let her know that he had been blameless. At this he kissed me again. I would expiate my sin, I said. I would humble myself in the dust. I would confess and ask to be forgiven. At this he kissed me once more. In the train the next day, this struck me as a good deal for him to have consented to, but my purpose was firm enough to carry me on. I mounted the long hill to where the view begins, and then I knocked at her door. I was a trifle mystified by the fact that her blinds were still drawn, reflecting that if in the stress of my compunction I had come early, I had certainly yet allowed people time to get up. "At home, Mum? She has left home forever." I was extraordinarily startled by this announcement of the elderly parlour-maid. "She's gone away?" "She's dead, Mum, please." Then, as I gasped at the horrible word, "She died last night." The loud cry that escaped me sounded even in my own ears like some harsh violation of the hour. I felt for the moment as if I had killed her. I turned faint and saw through a vagueness the woman hold out her arms to me. Of what next happened I have no recollection, or of anything but my friend's poor stupid cousin in a darkened room, after an interval that I suppose very brief, sobbing at me in a smothered, accusatory way. I can't say how long it took me to understand, to believe, then to press back with an immense effort that pang of responsibility which, superstitiously, insanely, had been at first almost all I was conscious of. The doctor, after the fact, had been superlatively wise and clear. He was satisfied of a long latent weakness of the heart, determined probably years before by the agitations and terrors to which her marriage had introduced her. She had had in those days cruel scenes with her husband, she had been in fear of her life. All emotion, everything in the nature of anxiety and suspense had been after that to be strongly deprecated, as in her marked cultivation of a quiet life she was evidently well aware. But who could say that anyone, especially a real lady, could be successfully protected from every little rub? She had had one a day or two before in the news of her husband's death, for there were shocks of all kinds, not only those of grief and surprise. For that matter, she had never dreamed of so near a release. It looked uncommonly as if he would live as long as herself. Then in the evening in town she had manifestly had another. Something must have happened there which it would be indispensable to clear up. She had come back very late, it was past 11 o'clock, and on being met in the hall by her cousin, who was extremely anxious, had said that she was tired and must rest a moment before mounting the stairs. They had passed together into the dining-room, her companion proposing a glass of wine, and bustling to the sideboard to pour it out. This took but a moment, and when my informant turned round, our poor friend had not had time to seat herself. Suddenly, with a little moan that was barely audible, she dropped upon the sofa. She was dead. What unknown little rub had dealt her the blow? What shock, in the name of wonder, had she had in town? I mentioned immediately the only one I could imagine, her having failed to meet at my house, to which by invitation for the purpose she had come at 5 o'clock, the gentleman I was to be married to, who had been accidentally kept away, and with whom she had no acquaintance whatever. This obviously counted for little, but something else might easily have occurred. Nothing in the London streets was more possible than an accident, especially an accident in those desperate cabs. What had she done? Where had she gone on leaving my house? I had taken for granted she had gone straight home. We both presently remembered that in her excursions to town she sometimes, for convenience, for refreshment, spent an hour or two at the Gentlewomen, the quiet little ladies' club, and I promised that it should be my first care to make at that establishment thorough inquiry. Then we entered the dim and dreadful chamber where she lay locked up in death, and where, asking after a little to be left alone with her, I remained for half an hour. Death had kept her beautiful. But I felt above all, as I kneeled at her bed, that it had kept her silent. It had turned the key on something I was concerned to know. On my return from Richmond, and after another duty had been performed, I drove to his chambers. It was the first time, but I had often wanted to see them. On the staircase, which, as the house contained 20 sets of rooms, was unrestrictedly public, I met his servant, who went back with me and ushered me in. At the sound of my entrance he appeared in the doorway of a further room, and the instant we were alone I produced my news. "She's dead." "Dead?" He was tremendously struck, and I observed that he had no need to ask whom, in this abruptness, I meant. "She died last evening, just after leaving me." He stared with the strangest expression, his eyes searching mine as if they were looking for a trap. "Last evening, after leaving you?" He repeated my words in stupefaction, and he brought out so that it was in stupefaction I heard, "Impossible! I saw her." "You saw her? On that spot, where you stand?" This brought back to me after an instant, as if to help me to take it in, the memory of the strange warning of his youth. "In the hour of death, I understand, as you so beautifully saw your mother." "Ah, not as I saw my mother. Not that way, not that way." He was deeply moved by my news, far more moved, I perceived, than he would have been the day before. It gave me a vivid sense that, as I had then said to myself, there was indeed a relation between them, and that he had actually been face to face with her. Such an idea, by its reassertion of his extraordinary privilege, would have suddenly presented him as painfully abnormal had he not so vehemently insisted on the difference. "I saw her living. I saw her to speak to her. I saw her as I see you now." It is remarkable that for a moment, though only for a moment, I found relief in the more personal, as it were, but also the more natural of the two phenomena. The next, as I embraced this image of her having come to him on leaving me, and of just what it accounted for in the disposal of her time, I demanded with a shade of harshness of which I was aware, "What on earth did she come for?" He had now had a minute to think, to recover himself and judge of effects, so that if it was still with excited eyes he spoke, he showed a conscious redness, and made an inconsequent attempt to smile away the gravity of his words. "She came just to see me. She came after what had passed at your house, so that we should, after all, at last meet. The impulse seemed to me exquisite, and that was the way I took it." I looked round the room where she had been, and I never had been. "And was the way you took it the way she expressed it?" "She only expressed it by being here and by letting me look at her. That was enough," he exclaimed with a singular laugh. I wondered more and more. "You mean she didn't speak to you?" "She said nothing. She only looked at me as I looked at her." "And you didn't speak either?" He gave me again his painful smile. "I thought of you. The situation was every way delicate. I used the finest tact, but she saw she had pleased me." He even repeated his dissonant laugh. "She evidently pleased you." Then I thought a moment. "How long did she stay?" "How can I say? It seemed 20 minutes, but it was probably a good deal less." 20 minutes of silence? I began to have my definite view, and now, in fact, quite to clutch at it. "Do you know you're telling me a story positively monstrous?" He had been standing with his back to the fire. At this, with a pleading look, he came to me. "I beseech you, dearest, to take it kindly." I could take it kindly, and I signified as much, but I couldn't somehow, as he rather awkwardly opened his arms, let him draw me to him. So there fell between us for an appreciable time the discomfort of a great silence. He broke it presently by saying, "There's absolutely no doubt of her death?" "Unfortunately none. I've just risen from my knees by the bed where they've laid her out." He fixed his eyes hard on the floor, then he raised them to mine. "How does she look?" "She looks at peace." He turned away again while I watched him, but after a moment he began, "At what hour then?" "It must have been near midnight. She dropped as she reached her house from an affection of the heart which she knew herself and her physician knew her to have, but of which patiently, bravely, she had never spoken to me." He listened intently, and for a minute he was unable to speak. At last he broke out with an accent of which the almost boyish confidence, the really sublime simplicity, rings in my ears as I write. "Wasn't she wonderful?" Even at the time I was able to do it justice enough to remark in reply that I had always told him so, but the next minute, as if after speaking he had caught a glimpse of what he might have made me feel, he went on quickly, "You see that if she didn't get home till midnight, I instantly took him up. There was plenty of time for you to have seen her. How so? I inquired, when you didn't leave my house till late. I don't remember the very moment. I was preoccupied. But you know that, though you said you had lots to do, you sat for some time after dinner. She, on her side, was all the evening at the Gentlewomen. I've just come from there. I've ascertained. She had tea there. She remained a long, long time. What was she doing all the long, long time? I saw that he was eager to challenge at every step my account of the matter. And the more he showed this, the more I found myself disposed to insist on that account, to prefer with apparent perversity an explanation which only deepened the marvel and the mystery, but which, of the two prodigies it had to choose from, my reviving jealousy found easiest to accept. He stood there pleading with a candour that now seems to me beautiful for the privilege of having, in spite of supreme defeat, known the living woman, while I, with the passion I wonder at today, though it still smoulders in a manner in its ashes, could only reply that, through a strange gift shared by her with his mother, and on her own side likewise hereditary, the miracle of his youth had been renewed for him, the miracle of hers for her. She had been to him, yes, and by an impulse as charming as he liked, but oh, she had not been in the body. It was a simple question of evidence. I had, I assured him, a definite statement of what she had done, most of the time, at the little club. The place was almost empty, but the servants had noticed her. She had sat motionless in a deep chair by the drawing-room fire. She had leaned back her head. She had closed her eyes. She had seemed softly to sleep. I see. But till what o'clock? There, I was obliged to answer, the servants fail me a little. The portress, in particular, is unfortunately a fool, though even she, too, is supposed to be a gentlewoman. She was evidently at that period of the evening, without a substitute and against regulations, absent for some little time from the cage in which it's her business to watch the comings and goings. She is muddled, she palpably prevaricates, so I can't positively, from her observation, give you an hour, but it was remarked toward 10:30 that our poor friend was no longer in the club. She came straight here, and from here she went straight to the train. She couldn't have run it so close, I declared. That was a thing she particularly never did. There was no need of running it close, my dear. She had plenty of time. Your memory's at fault about my having left you late. I left you, as it happens, unusually early. I am sorry my stay with you seemed long, for I was back here by 10. To put yourself into your slippers, I rejoined, and fall asleep in your chair. You slept till morning. You saw her in a dream. He looked at me in silence and with sombre eyes that showed me he had some irritation to repress. Presently I went on. You had a visit at an extraordinary hour from a lady. Swat! Nothing in the word is more probable. But there are ladies and ladies. How in the name of goodness, if she was unannounced and dumb and you had into the bargain never seen the least portrait of her, how could you identify the person we're talking of? Haven't I to absolute satiety heard her described? I'll describe her for you in every particular. Don't, I exclaimed with a promptness that made him laugh once more. I coloured at this, but I continued. Did your servant introduce her? He wasn't here. He's always away when he's wanted. One of the features of this big house is that from the street door the different floors are accessible practically without challenge. My servant makes love to a young person employed in the rooms above these, and he had a long bout of it last evening. When he's out on that job, he leaves my outer door on the staircase so much ajar as to enable him to slip back without a sound. The door then only requires a push. She pushed it. That simply took a little courage. A little? It took tons. It took all sorts of impossible calculations. Well, she had them. She made them. Mind you, I don't deny for a moment, he added, that it was very, very wonderful. Something in his tone prevented me for a while from trusting myself to speak. At last I said, How did she come to know where you live? Remembering the address on the little label the shop people happily left sticking to the frame I had made for my photograph. And how was she dressed? In mourning, my own dear. No great depths of crape, but simple and scrupulous black. She had in her bonnet 3 small black feathers. She carried a little muff of astrakhan. She has near the left eye, he continued, a tiny vertical scar. I stopped him short, the mark of a caress from her husband. Then I added, How close you must have been to her. He made no answer to this, and I thought he blushed, observing which I broke straight off. Well, good-bye. He won't stay a little. He came to me again tenderly, and this time I suffered him. Her visit had its beauty, he murmured as he held me, but yours is a greater one. I let him kiss me, but I remembered, as I had remembered the day before, that the last kiss she had given, as I supposed, in this world had been for the lips he touched. I'm life, you see, I answered. What you saw last night was death. It was life. It was life. He spoke with a kind of soft stubbornness, and I disengaged myself. We stood looking each other hard. You describe the scene, so far as you describe it at all, in terms that are incomprehensible. She was in the room before you knew it. I looked up from my letter writing, at the table under the lamp. I had been wholly absorbed in it, and she stood before me. Then what did you do? I sprang up with an ejaculation, and she, with a simple, laid her finger, with a smile, laid her finger, ever so warningly, yet with a sort of delicate dignity, to her lips. I knew it meant silence, but the strange thing was that it seemed immediately to explain and to justify her. We, at any rate, stood for a time that, as I've told you, I can't calculate face to face. He was just as you and I stand now, simply staring, he impatiently protested. Ah, we're not staring. Yes, but we're talking. Well, we were, after a fashion. He lost himself in the memory of it. It was as friendly as this. I had it on my tongue's end to ask if that were saying much for it, but I remarked instead that what they had evidently done was to gaze in mutual admiration. Then I inquired whether his recognition of her had been immediate. Not quite, he replied, for of course I didn't expect her, but it came to me long before she went who she was, who she could only be. I thought a little. And how did she at last go? Just as she arrived. The door was open behind her and she passed out. Was she rapid, slow? Rather quick. But looking behind her, he added with a smile, I let her go, for I perfectly understood that I was to take it as she wished. I was conscious of exhaling a long, vague sigh. Well, you must take it now as I wish. You must let me go. At this he drew near me again, detaining and persuading me, declaring with all due gallantry that I was a very different matter. I would have given anything to have been able to ask him if he had touched her, but the words refused to form themselves. I knew well enough how horrid and vulgar they would sound. I said something else, I forget exactly what. It was feebly tortuous and intended to make him tell me without my putting the question. But he didn't tell me. He only repeated, as if from a glimpse of the propriety of soothing and consoling me, the sense of his declaration of some minutes before, the assurance that she was indeed exquisite, as I had always insisted, but that I was his real friend and his very own forever. This led me to reassert, in the spirit of my previous rejoinder, that I had at least the merit of being alive, which in turn drew from him again the flash of contradiction I dreaded. Oh, she was alive! She was! She was! She was dead! She was dead! I asseverated with an energy, a determination that it should be so, which comes back to me now almost as grotesque. But the sound of the word as it rang out filled me suddenly with horror, and all the natural emotion the meaning of it might have evoked in other conditions gathered and broke in a flood. It rolled over me that here was a great affection quenched, and how much I had loved and trusted her. I had a vision at the same time of the lonely beauty of her end. She's gone! She's lost to us forever! I burst into sobs. That's exactly what I feel, he exclaimed, speaking with extreme kindness and pressing me to him for comfort. She's gone. She's lost to us forever. So what does it matter now? He bent over me, and when his face had touched mine, I scarcely knew if it were wet with my tears or with his own. It was my theory, my conviction. It became, as I may say, my attitude, that they had still never met. And it was just on this ground that I said to myself it would be generous to ask him to stand with me beside her grave. He did so, very modestly and tenderly, and I assumed, though he himself clearly cared nothing for the danger, that the solemnity of the occasion, largely made up of persons who had known them both and had a sense of the long joke, would sufficiently deprive his presence of all light association. On the question of what had happened the evening of her death, little more passed between us. I had been overtaken by a horror of the element of evidence. It seemed gross and prying on either hypothesis. He, on his side, had none to produce, none at least but a statement of his house porter, on his own admission a most casual and intermittent personage, that between the hours of 10 o'clock and midnight no less than 3 ladies in deep black had flitted in and out of the place. This proved far too much. We had neither of us any use for 3. He knew that I considered I had accounted for every fragment of her time, and we dropped the matter as settled. We abstained from further discussion. What I knew, however, was that he abstained to please me rather than because he yielded to my reasons. He didn't yield, he was only indulgent. He clung to his interpretation because he liked it better. He liked it better, I held, because it had more to say to his vanity. That, in a similar position, would not have been its effect on me, though I had doubtless quite as much. But these are things of individual humour, as to which no person can judge for another. I should have supposed it more gratifying to be the subject of one of those inexplicable occurrences that are chronicled in thrilling books and disputed about at learned meetings. I could conceive, on the part of a being just engulfed in the infinite and still vibrating with human emotion, of nothing more fine and pure, more high and august than such an impulse of reparation, of admonition, or even of curiosity. That was beautiful, if one would, and I should in this place have thought more of myself for being so distinguished. It was public that he had long been distinguished, and what was this in itself but almost a proof? Each of the strange visitations contributed to establish the other. He had a different feeling, but he had also, I hastened to add, an unmistakable desire not to make a stand or, as they say, a fuss about it. I might believe what I liked, the more so that the whole thing was in a manner a mystery of my producing. It was an event of my history, a puzzle of my consciousness, not of his. Therefore he would take about it any tone that struck me as convenient. We had both, at all events, other business on hand. We were pressed with preparations for our marriage. Mine was assuredly urgent, but I found as the days went on that to believe what I liked was to believe that I was more and more intimately convinced of. I found also that I didn't like it so much as that came to, or that the pleasure, at all events, was far from being the cause of my conviction. My obsession, as I may really call it, and as I began to perceive, refused to be elbowed away, as I had hoped, by my sense of paramount duties. If I had a great deal to do, I had still more to think about, and the moment came when my occupations were gravely menaced by my thoughts. I see it all now, I feel it, I live it over. It's terribly void of joy, it's full indeed to overflowing of bitterness, and yet I must do myself justice. I couldn't possibly be other than I was. The same strange impressions, had I to meet them again, would produce the same deep anguish, the same sharp doubts, the same still sharper certainties. Oh, it's all easier to remember than to write, but even if I could retrace the business hour by hour, could find terms for the inexpressible, the ugliness and the pain would quickly stay my hand. Let me then note very simply and briefly that a week before our wedding day, 3 weeks after her death, I became fully aware that I had something very serious to look in the face, and that if I was to make this effort, I must make it on the spot, and before another hour should elapse. My unextinguished jealousy, that was the Medusa mask. It hadn't died with her death, it had lividly survived, and it was fed by suspicions unspeakable. They would be unspeakable today, that is, if I hadn't felt the sharp need of uttering them at the time. This need took possession of me, to save me, as it appeared, from my fate. When once it had done so, I saw, in the urgency of the case, the diminishing hours and shrinking interval, only one issue, that of absolute promptness and frankness. I could at least not do him the wrong of delaying another day. I could at least treat my difficulty as too fine for a subterfuge. Therefore, very quietly, but none the less abruptly and hideously, I put it before him on a certain evening that we must reconsider a situation and recognize that it had completely altered. He stared bravely. How has it altered? Another person has come between us. He hesitated a moment. I won't pretend not to know whom you mean, he smiled in pity for my aberration, but he meant to be kind. A woman dead and buried. She's buried, but she's not dead. She's dead for the world, she's dead for me, but she's not dead for you. You hark back to the different construction we put on her appearance that evening? No, I answered. I hark back to nothing. I've no need of it. I've more than enough with what's before me. And pray, darling, what is that? You're completely changed. By that absurdity? He laughed. Not so much by that one as by other absurdities that have followed it. And what may they have been? We had faced each other fairly, with eyes that didn't flinch, but his had a dim, strange light, and my certitude triumphed in his perceptible paleness. Do you really pretend, I asked, not to know what they are? My dear child, he replied, you describe them too sketchily. I considered a moment. One may well be embarrassed to finish the picture, but from that point of view, and from the beginning, what was ever more embarrassing than your idiosyncrasy? He was extremely vague. My idiosyncrasy? Your notorious, your peculiar power. He gave a great shrug of impatience, a groan of overdone disdain. Oh, my peculiar power! Your accessibility to forms of life, I coldly went on. Your command of impressions, appearances, contacts closed, for our gain or our loss, to the rest of us. It was originally a part of the deep interest with which you inspired me, one of the reasons I was amused. I was indeed positively proud to know you. It was a magnificent distinction. It's a magnificent distinction still, but of course I had no prevision then of the way it would operate now, and even had that been the case, I should have had none of the extraordinary way in which its action would affect me. To what in the name of goodness, he pleadingly inquired, are you fantastically alluding? Then, as I remained silent, gathering a tone for my charge, how in the world does it operate? He went on, and how in the world are you affected? She missed you for 5 years, I said, but she never misses you now. You're making it up. Making it up? He had begun to turn from white to red. You see her. You see her. You see her every night. He gave a loud sound of derision, but it was not a genuine one. She comes to you as she came that evening, I declared. Having tried it, she found she liked it. I was able, with God's help, to speak without blind passion or vulgar violence, but those were the exact words, and far from sketchy they then appeared to me that I uttered. He had turned away in his laughter, clapping his hands at my folly, but in an instant he faced me again with a change of expression that struck me. Do you dare to deny, I asked, that you habitually see her? He had taken the line of indulgence, of meeting me halfway and kindly humouring me. At all events, to my astonishment, he suddenly said, Well, my dear, what if I do? It's your natural right. It belongs to your constitution and to your wonderful, if not perhaps quite enviable fortune, but you will easily understand that it separates us. I unconditionally release you. Release me? You must choose between me and her. He looked at me hard. I see. Then he walked away a little, as if grasping what I had said and thinking how he had best treat it. At last he turned upon me afresh. How on earth do you know such an awfully private thing? You mean because you've tried so hard to hide it? It is awfully private, and you may believe I shall never betray you. You've done your best, you've acted your part, you've behaved, poor dear, loyally and admirably. Therefore I have watched you in silence, playing my part too. I have noted every drop in your voice, every absence in your eyes, every effort in your indifferent hand. I have waited till I was utterly sure and miserably unhappy. How can you hide it when you are abjectly in love with her, when you are sick almost to death with the joy of what she gives you? I checked his quick protest with a quickie gesture. You love her as you've never loved, and passion for passion, she gives it straight back. She rules you, she holds you, she has you all. A woman, in such a case as mine, divines and feels and sees. She is not an idiot who has to be credibly informed. You come to me mechanically, compunctiously, with the dregs of your tenderness and the remnant of your life. I can renounce you, but I can't share you. The best of you is hers. I know what it is, and I freely give you up to her forever. He made a gallant fight, but it couldn't be patched up. He repeated his denial, he retracted his admission, he ridiculed my charge, of which I freely granted him, moreover, the indefensible extravagance. I didn't pretend for a moment that we were talking of common things. I didn't pretend for a moment that he and she were common people. Pray, if they had been, how should I ever have cared for them? They had enjoyed a rare extension of being, and they had caught me up in their flight. Only I couldn't breathe in such an air, and I promptly asked to be set down. Everything in the facts was monstrous, and most of all my lucid perception of them. The only thing allied to nature and truth was my having to act on that perception. I felt, after I had spoken in this sense, that my assurance was complete. Nothing had been wanting to it but the sight of my effect on him. He disguised indeed the effect in a cloud of chaff, a diversion that gained him time and covered his retreat. He challenged my sincerity, my sanity, almost my humanity, and that of course widened our breach and confirmed our rupture. He did everything, in short, but convince me either that I was wrong or that he was unhappy. We separated, and I left him to his inconceivable communion. He never married, any more than I've done. When 6 years later, in solitude and silence, I heard of his death, I hailed it as a direct contribution to my theory. It was sudden, it was never properly accounted for, it was surrounded by circumstances in which, for I took them to pieces, I distinctly read an intention, the mark of his own hidden hand. It was the result of a long necessity, of an unquenchable desire. To say exactly what I mean, it was a response to an irresistible call. Καλό βράδυ.